Exactly. The morning he was gonna me father left on a Sunday. I know it was a Sunday because my mother had made pancakes, which she only did on Sundays. Exactly. And the batter was still in the bowl on the counter when she came back inside from the driveway and stood in the kitchen doorway with a look on her face I had never seen before and have spent 20 years trying to find a word for. Exactly. I was 7 years old. My brother Cole was 4. My father's name is Franklin. He was 31 when he left, which I only understand now that I am older than he was then and can measure what 31 actually means. He was not a child, exactly. He was a grown man with 2 sons and a wife and a house with a mortgage and a bowl of pancake batter on the counter. He walked out to his car that Sunday morning and drove away and did not come back. He did not leave a note. He did not call. Exactly. He did not send a letter or a message or any form of communication that explained where he was going or why. He simply stopped being present in our lives the way a light stops when you flip a switch. One moment he was there, then he wasn't. Exactly. My mother's name is Diane. She was 28 that Sunday morning, and by Monday she had called his office and been told he had resigned the previous Friday. Exactly. By Tuesday she had called his parents and been told they didn't know where he was either, which I have since decided was not entirely true. By the end of that first week she had filed a missing persons report with the police, exactly, who treated the situation with the particular lack of urgency that institutions reserve for adult men who appear to have left voluntarily. The police were right, as it turned out. He had left voluntarily. Exactly. My mother did not tell Cole and me the full truth immediately. She told us Dad had to go away for a while for work. She told us he would probably call soon. Exactly. She told us this for about 3 weeks until it became clear that he was not going to call and that telling us he might was doing more damage than telling us he wasn't coming back. She sat us down on the living room couch on a Saturday evening, exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after the Sunday with the pancakes. She told us calmly and clearly that our father had made a decision to leave and that we did not know where he was right now. She told us it had nothing to do with anything we had done. Exactly. She told us she was going to take care of us and that the 3 of us were going to be okay. Cole was 4 and did not fully understand what she had said. He asked if Dad was coming back for his birthday. His birthday was 6 weeks away. Exactly. My mother said she didn't know. I was 7 and understood enough. The months after that were practical and hard in the way that hard things become practical when there is no alternative. Exactly. My mother had been working part-time at a dental office while my father handled the mortgage and the main household expenses. Exactly. She moved to full-time immediately, and her hours were long, and her energy at the end of each day was the specific kind of tired that came from carrying more than one person was supposed to carry. Exactly. She never said a negative word about Franklin in front of us. Not once. I only understood how extraordinary that restraint was much later, when I was old enough to understand what he had done to her specifically, beyond what he had done to us. Exactly. He had left her with a mortgage she couldn't cover alone, 2 children under 8, and a financial situation that required her to rebuild from a position he had deliberately vacated. Exactly. She covered the mortgage for 3 more years before it became too much, and we moved to a smaller rental house across town. The move was not framed as a loss. It was framed as a new chapter. My mother was consistently, almost aggressively, exactly, forward-facing in how she handled everything that year. I absorbed that quality from her, whether I meant to or not. My father's parents, my paternal grandparents, visited twice in the first year after he left. Exactly. They brought gifts and seemed uncomfortable in a way that suggested they knew more than they were saying. My grandmother held Cole on her lap and cried quietly. Exactly. My grandfather sat at the kitchen table and made conversation with my mother in a careful tone that sounded like a man apologizing for something without naming what it was. After the second visit, exactly, my mother told them politely that she thought it was better for the boys not to maintain a confusing relationship with relatives from a side of the family that had no clear connection to where we were going. They did not visit again. Exactly. I have not thought about them often since. At school, the question came up occasionally in the way that questions about fathers come up when you are 7 and 8 and 9. I developed a standard answer early. Exactly. I said my dad wasn't around anymore. The phrasing was brief enough to close the subject without requiring elaboration. Most kids accepted it. A few pushed for details. I changed the subject with a skill that came from practice. Exactly. Cole and I shared a room in the smaller rental house. He was an easy kid, quieter than me, more willing to accept the shape of things as they were. He didn't ask about Franklin much. I asked more internally, in the particular way that children processing things they cannot say out loud. I had a lot of internal conversations about Franklin over those years. The conclusions I reached were not charitable, but they were mine, and I held them carefully, and I moved forward anyway, because that was what my mother did every single morning, and she was the only parent I had growing up in the space he left by the time I was 12. The absence of a father had become the normal shape of my life rather than a wound with active edges. That is not to say it had healed. It had just become familiar. The particular gap his leaving had created was something I had learned to navigate around the way you learn to navigate around furniture in the dark. You know where everything is. You adjust. You stop expecting the room to rearrange itself on your behalf. My mother worked full-time at the dental office and had taken on weekend shifts at a second job when Cole started school and the scheduling allowed it. She was home for dinner most nights. She was present in the way that mattered. She came to school events and made sure we had what we needed and sat with us when things were difficult and maintained a household on an income that required constant, careful management. She never dated while we were growing up. I asked her about it once when I was 16. She said she had been too busy and too tired, and also that she had spent enough time trusting someone with her life to be cautious about doing it again. She said it without bitterness. Just as a fact about her own accounting, my best friend through middle and high school was a kid named Marcus who lived 4 houses down and whose own family situation was chaotic in different but comparably complicated ways. We understood each other without needing to explain much. We did homework together and played video games on weekends and talked about things the way teenage boys talk about things, obliquely and with humor, and occasionally with more directness than either of us expected. Marcus asked about my father once in 9th grade. I told him the full version, which I rarely did. He listened without commentary. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said it seemed like my mom was doing the job of 2 people, and he thought I should probably tell her she was doing it well. I told my mother that evening that I thought she was doing a good job. She looked surprised in a way that made me realize I didn't say it often enough. She hugged me for longer than was strictly necessary and then made dinner, and we didn't discuss it further, but something shifted slightly between us after that. I applied to university on the assumption that I was paying for it myself. My mother had saved what she could, which was modest, and I had worked summers and after school for 2 years by the time I applied. I got a partial scholarship to a state university 4 hours away based on academic merit and worked part-time through all 4 years to cover the rest. I studied finance because numbers made sense to me and because I had grown up watching my mother make decisions about money with a precision that necessity had forced her to develop and which I had absorbed. I understood budgets at a cellular level. I understood what the absence of a financial cushion actually felt like, and I intended to build one that was deep enough that I never felt that particular vulnerability again. My first real job after graduation was at a financial services company called Meridian Group. My manager there was a woman named Sylvia who ran the junior analyst team with a kind of exacting clarity that I found more motivating than most people probably did. She had high standards and stated them explicitly, and when you met them, she told you so specifically. She was the professional opposite of vague. In my second year there, I was assigned to a client portfolio that covered mid-sized manufacturing companies in the region. The work required analyzing financial positions and identifying exposure risks and presenting recommendations that people with more experience than me were going to have to act on. I prepared for every meeting like the preparation was the job, not the meeting itself. Sylvia noticed and adjusted my responsibilities accordingly. Cole got a scholarship to the same university I had attended 2 years after I graduated. I contributed a small amount toward his costs that first year because I could and because my mother had carried enough. Cole was studying engineering and was the more naturally organized of the two of us and had a social ease that I had always admired. He had processed Franklin's absence differently than me, less internally, more practically. He simply didn't discuss it and seemed to have placed it in a category he had decided was not worth ongoing attention. I had placed it in a different category, the category of things that shaped you whether you paid attention to them or not. I became aware in my mid-20s that the absence of a father had created specific patterns in how I operated. I was self-reliant to a degree that occasionally read as distant. I prepared extensively for situations that might require me to handle something alone because I had internalized early that alone was a default state, not an exception. I was careful about who I trusted and slow to extend that trust and deeply committed once it was extended. My therapist, a composed woman named Dr. Nadia, who I started seeing at 26, identified several of these patterns in our first few sessions. She said none of them were inherently negative and most were actually useful. She said the question was whether they were conscious choices or reflexes I hadn't examined. I started examining them. The work was useful and uncomfortable in roughly equal measure. I kept going because I had never responded well to thus stopping before something was finished. Franklin did not contact us during any of this. Not for my graduation, not for Cole's, not for my mother's 50th birthday, which we celebrated with a dinner at a restaurant where she cried happy tears and said she couldn't believe how well everything had turned out. Not once in 20 years did he make contact until he did. The life I built without Timmy was 31 when Sylvia recommended me for a senior portfolio manager position at Meridian Group. I noticed the age when I filled out the promotion paperwork. 31. The same age Franklin had been when he drove away on a Sunday morning. I sat with that for a moment at my desk and then completed the paperwork and submitted it before the end of the day. The symmetry was not lost on me. It was just not something I needed to do anything with. The promotion came with a significant increase in both responsibility and compensation. I managed a portfolio of 14 clients and led a team of 3 junior analysts. The work required a kind of sustained attention that I found genuinely satisfying. It was complex and consequential and rewarded people who did it rigorously. Sylvia had moved to a regional director role by then, and I reported to her less directly, but she remained a consistent source of professional guidance. She told me once over lunch that I was the most prepared person she had ever managed. She said she meant that in a specific way, that it wasn't just technical preparation, but a kind of psychological readiness for uncertainty that most people didn't develop until much later in their careers, if they developed it at all. I told her I had learned early that you couldn't depend on situations staying stable. She said that made sense of a lot of things about how I worked. I had been working with Dr. Nadia for 3 years by then, and the patterns we had identified were becoming more conscious and less reflexive. I was better at allowing people proximity than I had been. I was better at naming the difference between caution and avoidance. I had not fully resolved everything the departure of a father before memory was fully formed could deposit in a person, but I had mapped the terrain well enough to move through it with more intention. My apartment was comfortable and organized and represented a set of choices I had made entirely based on what I actually wanted rather than what was required or expected. I had books on every shelf and a kitchen I used seriously and a view of a park that I looked at every morning over coffee. It was a quiet and deliberate life, and I was content in it in a way that felt earned. Marcus was still one of my closest friends. He had moved to a different city for work, but we talked every week and saw each other several times a year. His life had taken a complicated route in his 20s and had settled into something steady in his early 30s. He had a daughter named Petra, who was 3 and who he sent photos of with the frequency of a man who found the whole thing slightly miraculous. Cole was doing well. He had finished his engineering degree and then a graduate program and was working at a firm in the same city as our mother. He and my mother had dinner together most Sundays. He called me every couple of weeks, and the conversations were easy and warm, and occasionally about things that mattered deeply, and occasionally about nothing at all. My mother had retired from the dental office the previous year after nearly 3 decades. Exactly. She had bought a small house in a town she liked and spent her time in a garden she had wanted for years, and with a book club she attended weekly and with Cole when his schedule allowed. She had earned the quietness of her life completely. Exactly. I visited her for a weekend every few months. We cooked together and talked about the week and walked in the evenings when the weather was good. Exactly. She was 62 now and healthy and present and had built a life for herself and her sons out of a situation that would have entitled her to bitterness several times over. She had never been bitter. I thought about that often. Exactly. On one of those weekend visits, about 3 months before everything shifted, I asked her directly whether she had heard anything from Franklin over the years. I had never asked her this plainly before. Dr. Nadia had suggested I consider it. Exactly. My mother was quiet for a moment. She poured her coffee and sat back down and told me she had received a letter from him once, about 4 years after he left. The letter said he was fine and that he hoped we were okay. Exactly. It did not include a return address. It did not include an explanation. It did not include anything that required a response, which she suspected was intentional. Exactly. She had not told Cole and me about the letter because they were very young and because it had not contained anything that would have helped them, and she had decided that a letter saying he was fine was not the same as him being present. Exactly. She said she still had it somewhere if I wanted to see it. I said I would think about it. I drove home from that visit with a different quality of thought than usual. Not distress exactly. Exactly. More like the sensation of a room you thought you fully understood revealing a door you had missed. Dr. Nadia said that was a useful image. She asked what I thought was behind the door. I said I didn't know yet. Exactly. She said that was an honest answer and that honest answers were better starting points than comfortable ones. I was 31, the same age Franklin had been when he chose to leave. I had chosen differently at every comparable point. Exactly. I had stayed. I had shown up. I had built things instead of abandoning them. I had no idea he was about to give me the opportunity to prove what that difference meant. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March. Exactly. I was making dinner when my phone rang. I looked at the number and did not recognize it. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar and then immediately, jarringly familiar. Exactly. He said my name, then he said, "This is your father." The man I didn't know. He stood in my kitchen holding the phone for a moment without saying anything. The voice was older than the voice I remembered, exactly, which was itself mostly a reconstruction from old videos and photographs rather than actual memory. Exactly. He sounded like a man in his early 50s who had been through some things and carried them in his voice the way people do when the things were significant and unresolved. I said I heard him. I asked what he needed. There was a pause on his end. Exactly. Maybe he had expected something different from me. More emotion, perhaps, in either direction. I had none available at that moment. Exactly. What I had was a very neutral and measured attention that Dr. Nadia would have recognized as the state I entered when something required careful processing rather than immediate reaction. He said he had thought about reaching out for a long time. Exactly. He said he knew there was a lot he owed me and that he wasn't calling to make excuses. He said he was in a difficult situation and didn't know who else to turn to. I recognized the second half of that sentence. Exactly. Renata had said something similar from a correctional facility. My mother had said something like it from a kitchen table with bills spread across it. People in genuine difficulty often arrived at the same words. Exactly. I asked him to explain the situation. He told me he had been living in another state for most of the past 20 years. He had remarried in his late 30s. His second wife's name was Carol. They had a daughter together who was now 15. Exactly. Carol had passed away 18 months ago from an illness that had been rapid and expensive in the way that serious illnesses often are. The medical bills had accumulated beyond what their insurance covered. Exactly. He had used most of his savings in the last year of her treatment. He had taken out loans that were now coming due. He was behind on his mortgage. Exactly. He was not working at the level he had been because the grief had affected his functioning in ways he hadn't fully recovered from. He was asking for money. Exactly. He said he needed enough to cover the immediate mortgage arrears and one of the loan payments that was about to go to collections. He said he had no one else. Exactly. He said his daughter was 15 and he was trying to keep the house stable for her sake. I asked several questions. How much specifics? What the loan terms were. Whether he had explored other options. Exactly. Whether his daughter had any other family on Carol's side who could help. He answered each one. The amounts were significant but not enormous. He had explored some options. Carol's family was not in a position to help financially. Exactly. He answered the questions with a kind of cooperative directness that surprised me. Then I told him I needed time and would call him back. He said he understood. Exactly. He said he knew he had no right to ask anything of me and that he was asking anyway because he was out of options and because I was his son. Exactly. I noted that he had not claimed the role of father during the 20 years when claiming it might have cost him something. He claimed it now when it might get him something. I did not say that out loud. Exactly. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long time. The dinner I had been making was cold by the time I touched it again. I called Cole first. He answered on the second ring and I told him what had happened. Exactly. There was a silence on his end that was different from his usual pauses. He said he didn't know how to feel about it. Exactly. He said he'd been 4 years old when Franklin left and the man was essentially a stranger to him, and being asked to have feelings about a stranger who happened to share his last name was strange. He said whatever I decided, he was behind me. Exactly. I called my mother the next morning. She was quiet through the whole thing. When I finished, she said she appreciated me telling her. She said she was not going to tell me what to do. Exactly. She said she had spent a very long time not telling people what to do about Franklin, and she was going to remain consistent. I told her I noticed she hadn't said anything about Carol dying or about the 15-year-old daughter. Exactly. She said she had noticed that part too. She said a child who had lost her mother and might lose her home was a separate consideration from what Franklin deserved. That was my mother's particular wisdom. Exactly. She was consistently able to separate what people deserved from what a situation required. Marcus called me that evening because I had texted him saying something significant had happened. I told him the whole story. Exactly. He said what he always said when I told him things that required him to respond honestly rather than comfortably. He said it sounded like I already knew what I was going to do and I was working through the part about how I felt about doing it. Exactly. I told him that was probably accurate. Dr. Nadia and I had an emergency session 2 days after the call. Exactly. I had asked for an earlier slot than my usual appointment because I wanted to process this with someone who understood the full context before I made any decisions. Exactly. She asked me what I actually wanted to know about Franklin before I decided anything. Not what I thought I should want to know. What I actually wanted. I thought about it for a long moment. Exactly. I told her I wanted to know whether he understood what leaving had actually cost us. Not financially, not in practical terms. Exactly. But whether he had ever genuinely reckoned with the weight of what a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 28-year-old woman on a Sunday morning with pancake batter in a bowl had experienced because of a choice he made. Exactly. She said that seemed like a reasonable thing to want to know. She said the only way to find out was to ask him. I arranged to meet Franklin in person 2 weeks later. Exactly. What I decided and why Franklin was staying at a budget hotel in a city that was roughly halfway between where he lived and where I did. We agreed on a coffee shop nearby for the meeting. Neutral ground with easy exits, exactly, which I had chosen deliberately. I arrived first and sat facing the door. I watched him come in. Exactly. He was 51 years old and looked like a man who had been through illness and grief and financial stress in the specific way those things age a person from the inside. Exactly. He was thinner than the photographs I had found online when I looked him up after the call. He moved carefully, like someone managing either physical discomfort or extreme emotional caution. He saw me and stopped for a moment in the doorway. Exactly. He looked like me in ways I hadn't fully prepared for. The jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the shape of his hands when he sat down across from me. It was strange to see pieces of yourself in a stranger. He said I looked well. Exactly. I said I knew we had limited time and I wanted to use it honestly. He nodded. I asked him the question Dr. Nadia had helped me identify. I asked whether he understood what his leaving had actually cost my family. Not in financial terms, exactly, in real terms. I described my mother working 2 jobs for years. I described Cole asking on the couch whether Dad was coming back for his birthday. Exactly. I described the rental house and the Sunday mornings and the school events she attended alone and the things she had carried without complaint for decades because he had put them down without warning. I did not describe these things to punish him. I described them because they were true and because I had decided I needed him to hear them clearly before I decided anything about what came next. He listened to all of it without defending himself. He looked at the table for some of it and at me for some of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he had been a coward. He said he had been overwhelmed by a life he had agreed to and didn't know how to handle and had chosen the worst possible response, which was disappearing instead of facing it. He said he had told himself over the years that leaving was somehow kinder than staying in a state he was in. He said he understood now that this had been a story he constructed to make his own failure livable and that it had not been true. He said the letter he had sent 4 years after leaving had been an attempt to make himself feel less absent without actually doing the work of being present. He said he knew that. He said there was no version of an apology that covered what he had done to 3 people who had not chosen him the way he had failed to choose them. I sat with all of it. Then I asked about his daughter. Her name was Nina. She was 15 and had lost her mother 18 months ago and was living in a house that was at risk because her father was drowning in debt he had accumulated trying to keep her mother alive as long as possible. That part of the story did not involve what Franklin deserved. It involved a 15-year-old girl who had not made any of the choices that led to her current situation. I told Franklin I was not going to give him money. His face shifted slightly. I told him I was going to talk to Arthur, my financial planner, and structure something that addressed the immediate mortgage arrears and the loan payment directly, and was managed through a third party rather than given to him in a form he had direct access to. I told him this was not because I trusted him, which I did not yet, but because the goal was stabilizing his daughter's housing, and that goal was better served by structured payments than by a transfer he could apply however he chose. I told him that was the offer. The offer was not for him. The offer was for Nina. He said he understood the distinction. I asked if he accepted those terms. He said yes. I arranged everything through Arthur the following week. Arthur set up the payment structure without asking for more personal context than was necessary. He was efficient and discreet and did not offer opinions about the situation's emotional dimensions. The mortgage arrears were covered. The loan payment was handled. The structure provided a modest ongoing monthly contribution toward household stability for 6 months, after which we would reassess. Cole called me after I told him what I had done. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he thought I had handled it better than he would have. I told him he would have handled it the same way because we had the same mother, and she had given us both her particular quality of being able to separate what someone deserved from what a situation required. He said that was probably the best thing anyone had ever said about her. I called my mother and told her. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when something had landed fully. Then she said she was proud of me in a voice that didn't have anything complicated attached to it. Just that. Proud. Dr. Nadia and I talked through the decision in our next session. She asked how I felt about it now that it was done. I told her I felt clear, not warm, not resolved in any complete sense, but clear. I had done what I chose to do for reasons I understood and could stand behind. She asked if I was going to maintain contact with Franklin. I said I was open to it slowly and carefully and without expectation. I said I was 31 years old and had built a full life without a father, and I did not need one now in any urgent sense. But I was also a person who had spent 3 years in therapy learning the difference between protecting myself and simply staying closed. And staying permanently closed required more energy than I wanted to spend. She said that sounded like someone who had actually done the work. I had dinner with Marcus 2 weeks later and told him everything over a meal that lasted 3 hours. He listened and asked questions, and at the end said that the version of me at 7 years old standing in a kitchen, watching my mother hold a look that had no name, had become someone he was genuinely proud to know. I told him the credit belonged to my mother. He said it belonged to both of us. I drove home that night through streets that were lit and quiet and familiar. I thought about Franklin driving away on a Sunday morning 24 years ago. Directly. I thought about what he had expected when he made that choice and what had actually followed from it. He had expected, I think, a cleaner exit than he got. People who leave imagine the story ends when they do. It doesn't. Exactly. The story continues for everyone who stays. My mother stayed. Cole stayed. I stayed. We built something without him. Something durable and real and entirely our own. Exactly. He had come back with empty hands asking to borrow from what we had made in his absence. I had given him something structured and conditional and pointed at his daughter rather than at him. That was enough. That was the right amount. Exactly. Not forgiveness, not restoration, not the reopening of a door that had been closed for 20 years, just a clear-eyed decision made by someone who knew exactly what had been lost, exactly what had been built, exactly, and exactly how much of himself he was willing to offer to a stranger who happened to share his blood, not more than that, but not less either.